What's up guys, Alex here and I'm back with a new tutorial, this time on Reverb with orchestra music. So Reverb is a really important thing to master and to learn how to use because it helps into making your track sound huge, and it also helps you placing all these instruments that you usually use in orchestral music. It helps you place them in the front or in the back of the track. So basically, reverb is useful to recreate a sense of space inside your tracks so that it doesn't sound dry. And to show you how I use reverb to achieve these things, I have a track here which is a remix I started recently. While it's still in the works and I only wrote the beginning so far, and it doesn't sound perfect. It's still good material to explain you how I use reverb. So we're gonna take this track and I'm gonna play it, and while it plays I'm gonna toggle the reverb on and off so that you can hear the difference it makes when there is no reverb and when there is reverb instead. So let's check out this track in 3, 2, 1, go. So as you might have noticed, as I toggled the reverb off, most of the instruments kind of lost their depth. So what ended up happening is that the overall track lost a good amount of power, and everything sounded much more centered and much more in the front. And this is what the absence of reverb does to a track. Reverb is a pretty useful thing to use if you want your tracks to sound huge, because when you activate it on each instrument gains that sense of depth. And when you add up every single reverb signal of every single instrument, you get a soaring layer on top of everything, which adds a sense of space, which in turn makes your track sound bigger. Now you have to be careful with it, because if you use reverb too much, it's gonna sound kinda messy and muddy. So for example, say if I turn the dry signal down so that you can hear the reverb more, if you use too much reverb, it will sound like this. Almost like you're hearing echo of the sound, and not like you're having the song performed in front of you, but like you're, for example, outside of the venue and you hear the overall echoes. And you want to avoid that, because generally when you write music and when you produce music, you want to create that sense that the listener is in front of the performers or in front of the band, in this case in front of the orchestra. But you also want to create a sense of space and room. In order to do that, I use this reverb called ValhallaRoom, which is a pretty nice reverb. You can use any reverb to create a sense of space in your track, even the stock reverb in your DAW, but this one is pretty cool. It's a cool bang for the buck because it costs only $50 and it's great. And as you see here, it's kind of simple. It has these 5 main parameters and some advanced parameters here as well. These ones I never used them before because I haven't gone really much in depth about reverb. But anyway, even if you do not know what all of this means, there are many presets to use here. So yeah, it's a great reverb unit you have. And the way I use this is that I use only 1 unit of reverb in the overall mixer. And I'm going to explain you why now, because this is something I learned with experience. Initially, I tended to use like one reverb unit for every single instrument in the mixer. So it ended up happening that I had like 10 or 20 reverb units in the track. And that is kind of troublesome because, say for example, you want to edit the overall amount of reverb in your track. In that case, you'd have to tweak every single instance of the reverb. Instead, if you have only one instance, you can change whatever you want in the reverb one time, and it does, like, that change is applied to every single instrument. So anyway, let's take a look at how I applied reverb to every single instrument and how I used it to make things sound in the front or in the back. Let's take, for example, these short strings here. Okay, so let's take a more in-depth look at the mixer here. So as you can see, the mixer has many different channels here. These group channels, these gray channels are group channels, and a dry and wet channel. So I'm going to explain you the reasoning behind my mixer setup. So here we have these two layers of strings, viola spiccato and viola spiccato 2. Sorry, viola spiccato 2. My Italian side came off. Anyway, let's play them. As you can see, they are sent to two mixer channels, yeah. And these two channels are not sent to the master directly. Rather, they are sent to the short strings group, which is this mixer channel here. So this mixer group is not sent directly to the master either. This is where the reverb comes in. As you can see here, this if you're not using FL Studio, these green circles determine the volume at which a signal is sent to another mixer track. So here, as you can see, the string short is being sent to two different channels. A dry channel containing simply an EQ and a volume boost, and a wet channel that has the same EQ and volume boost, but also the ValhallaRoom unit, set to 100% mix, which means 100% wet reverb. So let's check out these two channels independently from one another. This is the dry channel, and this is the wet channel. So basically the purpose of the wet channel is to have all the reverb signal, and the dry only has the dry signal of the instruments. Now, the ratio between the volume at which you send an instrument to the dry channel compared to the wet channel is what is going to make that instrument sound much more in the front rather than in the back. Or if you send an instrument more in the wet channel rather than the dry channel, it's going to sound much more in the back instead. So to explain you that, or to show you that, I have this controller here I created for every single instrument in the mixer. For every single instrument group in the mixer, which basically determines both the panning and the reverb level of the instrument. When I move the y-axis, it changes the ratio between the dry and the wet signal of the instrument, while when I move the x-axis, it changes the panning. So let's play the strings while I play with this controller here, and so that I can show you the effect it has. Basically, when I'm gonna move this up, it's going to feed the strings much more in the wet channel rather than in the dry channel. And when I move it down, it's gonna feed much more of the strings in the dry channel compared to the wet channel. So up is gonna mean a lot of reverb, and down is gonna mean no reverb at all, or almost no reverb. So let's check out the impact it has when I play the strings. When I move the controller while the strings play. So as you heard, it's not like it's changing the sound, but it's making the strings sound much more like they are played not right in front of you when I pull it up. Compared to this, when I move it down, it sounds like the string player is right in front of you, and you're like in this tiny room, compared to this, when it feels like the string player is in front of you, but you're inside the venue and you're kind of far away from him, watching him from, from the seating of the venue, compared to being right in front of him or right next to him. And yeah, as you can see here, like, pay attention to these two circles as I move the y-axis. You see the two circles, the two green circles kind of change their ratio. And so yeah, that's what happens. And that's how you can make your instrument sound in the back or in the front of the room, by changing how much wet signal opposed to dry signal the instrument has. So again, you can do this by placing, for example, a unit of reverb on every single instrument group, but it's not like you're gonna shoot yourself in the foot, because again, it's going to, every reverb unit is gonna eat quite a good amount of RAM and processing power, so it's best to use one only. And I'm also going to show you the practical use I make about this, like about using a single reverb unit. For example, say I have this part here, and I suddenly decide that I want to lower the amount of reverb in this part. If I had one unit of ValhallaRoom on every single instrument group, if I wanted to lower the overall amount of reverb, I would have to go on every unit and edit, for example, the mix ratio here. But since I only have one unit which has 100% wet signal of the overall instrumentation of the track, what I could do is to edit the volume of this unit to reduce the amount of reverb. So for example, let's check out what happens to the track when I reduce the amount of the volume of the wet channel here. You see the reverb, the overall reverb, and the sense of space in the track gets reduced. So this is useful. Like, using one reverb unit only is useful because you can modify its volume, thus affecting the overall track in one simple click or slide of mouse. So yeah, that's why it's so cool, and it also saves you a lot of power. And also, I don't know if I said this already in this video, but I'm not sure if it's 100% true, but it is said that when you feed many different instruments inside a single reverb unit, the overall signals, all the different signals of the instruments which are fed into the reverb kind of interact between each other. So the overall reverb sound gets shaped in a more realistic way compared to what it would sound like if you had one reverb unit for every single instrument. So yeah, there's only profit in using one reverb only this way. So you basically create one wet channel in your mixer, and you send all your instruments group in the wet channel and in the dry channel at different ratios. And yeah, if you send more signal to the wet channel compared to the dry channel, it's going to sound in the back. And if you send much more dry signal instead of a wet signal, it's going to sound in the front. Now, generally speaking, when you set an instrument much more in the back of the room, it's going to sound much more deep, and it's going to have much more tail, but it's also going to sound less powerful. So one thing you have to keep in mind is, for example, for percussion, you do not want to use too much reverb. And I do not have too much percussion in this track to show you what they sound like when there is way too much reverb, but anyway, let's take a look. Okay, so this is the percussion here, and it's kind of sort of good because it has that power and it has that tail, but if I move the percussion way back, you can hear they kind of lose a good amount of power. Even if they are much more big, they sound much more in the distance, so they do not have the same attack. So for percussion, you want to use reverb, but not too much, and also because when you place percussion in the reverb, since percussion are so boomish, they have so many low frequencies. When you feed those low frequencies to a reverb, the response is kind of muddy, and yeah, this is what happens when you feed low frequencies inside a reverb. This is why before my reverb unit, I placed a little bit of low cut here, because when it comes to low frequencies, the reverb processes them in a funny way, which makes the sound not too much natural. Because I'm not sure about this, but maybe in our world, like, low frequencies get reverberate much less than mid and high frequencies. So when you send low frequencies to a digital reverb like this, basically, since it's digital, it doesn't necessarily follow the same rules of physics we have in our world. So even if the frequencies are low, the reverb is going to act on them regardless. But that is not what happens in nature. So be careful when sending instruments with lots of bass frequencies to a reverb, because naturally you wouldn't have so many low frequencies inside the echoes of a room. So what I do with the percussion is I send them to the reverb, but not too much. And yeah, if I did not send them, they would sound like they were in front of me. For example, like this. Which is kind of good, but when you add them up to the overall sound of all the instruments in the track, having the percussion so much in the front kind of ruins the illusion that you're creating with your production. So what you want to do is to have your percussion be coherent with the rest of the instruments in terms of dry and wet ratio, but without having them being too much back in the room, because they create that muddiness, which is not good. Anyway, for other instruments, for example, say choir, you can place them in the back of the room because you don't necessarily need too much power when it comes to the attack of your choir. So for example, let's check out the choir here. Maybe this track is not the best example because the choir here is kind of defining and is playing the main melody, so it's good to have it much more in the front. But anyway, let's check out what happens to the choir when I move it back. You hear it gets this sort of like pad-ish quality, which basically fills your headphones or your stereo with the sound of the choir, which is kind of cool because it creates a certain ambience which the track can be built on. So, and also the choir do not have so many bass frequencies because the human voice usually focuses on the mid frequency. So the choir, you can definitely send it to the reverb a lot, and it helps. But in this track, I kind of used it a little bit more in the front because it's playing the main melody. As a final thing, let's take a look at the main parameters that almost every reverb you're gonna use is gonna have. pre-delay, decay, high cut, and depth. So the pre-delay. The cool thing about ValhallaRoom is that when you hover on a parameter, it's gonna show you a description here of what that parameter does. So pre-delay sets the amount of delay before the reverb. What this does is that it basically allows you to play the reverb after a certain delay time. So for example, this is set to 10 milliseconds, but if I were to increase to 200 milliseconds, this is what it would sound like. The reverb comes in much after, which is not natural, but anyway, you can use this to edit the amount of lag or delay before the reverb gets triggered. Now, decay, this is something cool. This basically helps you increase the overall fade out tail that the reverb creates for your track. So let's check out what happens if I increase the decay to 30 seconds. Basically, the track fades out, the reverb signal fades out and goes on for much longer. And while this isn't something like for a reverb that you're using as a room, for example, in this track, this increasing the decay so much is not so useful and creates almost an unrealistic sense of space, almost like you were in space, like with big ass echoes like that. But you can use this to create something cool. For example, when it comes to sound design, and you say you want to create a pad sound, you can send a piano to a reverb with something like 30 seconds of decay. So when you play a note, for example, let's check out what happens if I play the note with a piano here with decay set to 30 seconds. You see, this is cool. This is creating a pad with a single piano note, because it's basically a reverb that gets that repeats itself for 30 seconds. Anyway, then we have high cut, which is basically a high cut filter, which helps your reverb be a little bit less sharp because it cuts off, or rather reduces, the volume of the high frequencies after this frequency here, 5200 hertz. Anyway, this helps your reverb sound less sharp and more pleasing to the ears. And then we have depth, which is a very interesting parameter, which helps creating that sense of space, because depth basically regulates how much distant the instruments inside the reverb sound. And let's have a look at what depth, the impact that has. Here in the track it's set to 90%, but let's see what happens as I play the track when I lower it. Maybe it wasn't too much audible, so let's check out what happens to the wet signal when I move depth. The digital room we're creating with the reverb feels much more narrow and small when I move the depth down compared to when I move it up. And this is something you can make use of to, create bigger or smaller rooms. In this track, I wanted to create something like a big concert venue, so I used the depth at very high settings here, 90%. Anyway, these were the 5 main parameters of reverbs, and that's it for the tutorial of the day. Anyway, guys, I hope you learned something new today. And by the way, if you think I forgot to mention something in this tutorial, or If you have questions or didn't understand something I explained, just ask away in the comments, and I'm gonna do my best to answer you and clear your doubts. Anyway, sorry if I'm kind of slow at releasing tutorials, guys, but many of these things I'm talking about. Even before I release the tutorials, I want to make sure that I know what I'm talking about. I do not want to release tutorials on stuff I do not understand myself. So yeah, when it comes to orchestral music, I'm still a learner, because even though I am a professional trailer music composer, most of my compositions, when it comes to the trailer music world, are much more electronic based and not so much orchestral. So orchestral music is something I'm still learning myself. So before I make a tutorial on orchestral music, I kind of study the thing I want to tell you guys about. So yeah, these tutorials are basically based on the things I discover these days about orchestral music by practicing and writing it myself. And this is also the reason why I'm also writing so many orchestral tracks now, because I really want to learn this genre of music. Anyway, if you want to learn orchestral music too, stay tuned for more videos from this channel and subscribe, because I'm going to release a lot of tutorials on the matter, and there are quite some few already in this channel. Also, there are some few music mindset vlogs, and which I'm going to keep posting in the future, where I talk about, I give advice to less experienced composers and producers based on the mistakes I made, or the lessons I learned, or the mindsets I used to achieve the success in my music career so far. So yeah, you might want to check those out too if you're less experienced, or if you're looking for inspiration. Anyway, that's it for today, and I'll see you guys soon on the next tutorial.